Well,
There it is.
well, welcome and good evening. Many of us watching the news from the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict were left scratching our heads, confused when the annexation promised by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu expired on its deadline, early July. This perhaps shocked some viewers less than when Kahol Lavan, Israeli opposition leader Benny Gantz, former general, after he managed to get part of the young Arab vote inside Israel, made great concessions to both Likud and the so-called Trump peace plan, despite that Gantz won his recent election in April on promises of opposing these very forces and reversing the infamous 2017 nation-state law, which a Likud politician called the law of all laws, echoing perhaps Saddam Hussein's avowed mother of all wars. Gantz promised to limit the power of organized religion in Israel. The annexation has predictably drawn inflamed responses from Hamas, from neighboring Lebanon, within Israel, within the UN. It threatens to the chagrin, perhaps, of Likud to unite rival Palestinian factions like Hamas, PLO, and the Palestinian Authority. 25 EU lawmakers vowed to declare sanctions on Israel if annexation proceeded. Recently, inside DM25, we also saw some inflamed internal discussion around the EU's potential and responsibilities in ameliorating or in no longer abetting the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We can explore this and related issues tonight in this conversation with Dr. Mouin Rabbani, co-editor and co-founder of Jalaliya.com, which is a prolific, respected online source of Arabic and Middle East world journalism, as well as a scholarly, even literary news and debate website. A historian and political analyst, Mouin Rabbani, born in the Netherlands into the Palestinian diaspora, has edited publications like Al-Haq newspaper, co-wrote articles and books with the famous activist scholar Dr. Norman Finkelstein. He studied at Tufts and Georgetown University in the late 1980s, around the time of the First Intifada. Rabbani has appeared as a speaker on Al Jazeera, Democracy Now, and now on DM25 Goes Local. And in arenas of the Middle East and Europe, he has challenged myths and misconceptions about the Middle East, offering substantial political proposals as to what can be done. Rabbani also worked in municipal governments of the Netherlands, which has almost no comparison, I can imagine, to the politics of the Middle East. Welcome, Mouin, and if anything in that introduction has been completely off the mark or inaccurate.
Well, thank you, Arturo, and thank you for your generous introduction. Perhaps two small corrections. I don't have a doctorate, and although I'm a co-editor of Jadiliya, I was not a co-founder of the electronic magazine, but thank you.
Well,
it's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes. Well, in the Jalaliya.com, of which you are a co-editor, you have given a very extensive interview analysis as to different reasons why annexation was postponed. And I think that the current confusion forces us to talk about this actuality. In this interview, very interestingly, you cited the upcoming U.S. elections as considerations that Netanyahu is watching. You cited Israeli journalist Anshel Pfeiffer's view that this was another election season media ploy by Netanyahu. To what extent would the threat issued by many EU member states and 25 EU lawmakers to impose sanctions in response to an eventual annexation? To what extent does that figure as a high priority in Israel's decision making?
Well, it's a very interesting question, but perhaps it would be useful to begin with a little background about annexation and what it means. This is, I think, what we should talk about is not whether Israel will or will not annex West Bank territory, or rather additional West Bank territory, but whether it will formally annex such territory. Because what we've seen over the past 50 plus years, effectively since the immediate aftermath of the June 1967 Arab-Israeli War, when Israel occupied these territories, it already began with acts of annexation, formal in the case of East Jerusalem, and then later the Golan Heights and other areas along the Green Line, and informal throughout the entirety of the West Bank through areas, through actions such as establishing illegal settlements and expanding them and so on. So it's important to recognize that a very significant portion of the West Bank is, for all intents and purposes, already incorporated by the Israeli state in a process that is known as creeping annexation. And so the real issue that's been on the political agenda for the past year or so is whether Israel will maintain this informal de facto annexation of territory as occupied since 1967, or whether it will take the process to its logical conclusion and seek to formally annex them, which of course is a legal and administrative act that goes beyond what it has already done. Now, in terms of your question, I think this has put the Europeans and the European Union in a bit of a bind because, as you remember, when Russia conducted an act of annexation in the Crimea, I believe it was in 2014, the European Union basically went all hysterical. This was a flagrant and brazen violation of international law, imposed sanctions, other measures that remain to this day. Problem now is they're faced with an act of annexation that on the one hand they don't believe in and they don't support and they don't like, but on the other hand is an act that is being carried out by one of the states that they have indulged perhaps more than any other over the past 70 years, and at the same time is an act supported by their chief international ally, the United States. Yes, please.
Yes, sorry if I may interrupt. So it's an interesting comparison that you draw between the EU very consensual response to the annexation of Crimea by Russia, which is also very directly linked to NATO and to the willingness, I think, to be cohesive with American interests and mandates. But what about the Visegrad group, as they call it? So, like in the case of Russia, Hungary clearly has an anti-Russian rhetoric, along with Poland's. The history of Russia, the tensions of Russia, much more easily lead to a unanimity in the European Union, where people have varying.
Yes. Well, this is exactly the point that I was getting to, is that when it comes to annexation by Israel, first of all, there is no European consensus, or rather consensus within the member states of the European Union. And a key reason is that this Visegrad group of right-wing populist nationalist governments basically see Israel as an ally and a model. And particularly Orban of Hungary has been running interference on behalf of his friend and ally, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, to ensure that the EU cannot adopt any resolutions by consensus. So again, getting back to your initial question, when there is no consensus, unanimity among the member governments of the EU, the capacity for the EU to respond to a foreign policy question is quite limited. The European Commission in Brussels has the authority, for example, to suspend or even revoke various agreements that are made between the EU as an institution and Israel as a foreign state. But the EU does not have the authority to compel its member states to take any measures unless there is unanimity on such measures. And even then, we haven't yet seen any unambiguous, clear, and definitive statements about what, if any, punitive measures Brussels or any of the member states, for that matter, would take against Israel if it proceeds with acts of formal annexation, which I should add are still very much on the Israeli agenda.
Well, some EU member states were less ambiguous and more vociferous than others. But since we got started on how Hungary and Poland, these allies, blackball and prevents such unanimity, which I find historically quite ironic, of course. I mean, because
Poland,
I don't.
Hungary, I'll be happy to explain why, but go ahead.
We'll get to this in a moment. Yes, I mean, I'm very eager to hear this, but I mean, Hungary and Poland and other, these heads of state, these figures have stated rather revisionist statements about the Second World War,
yes.
About the history of the Second World War and their responsibilities to the Jewish community that once
and
existed.
Israel has been very indulgent of that, one might add.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I've heard you previously, I believe, express the hope that Hungary and Orban, for various abuses, might face censure or even expulsion from the EU. And I'm curious as to your views as to this friendship with Netanyahu, how it has developed, how Viktor Orban, the current governments of Poland and Czech Republic, who express historical revisionism, how this nexus of alliances between these strange bedfellows, Likud and Orban, why do they like each other, and what other problems does this Visegrad group present for us, those of us who want to see progress in the Israel-Palestine conflict?
Well, if I can perhaps begin with two small historical notes. The first regarding the aspiration I had expressed of Hungary's membership in the EU being suspended or frozen or ideally terminated until they change their atrocious behavior with regard to the rule of law and all the rest of it. And, there are precedents for these things. When Jörg Haidar's neo-fascist party in Austria first entered government in the 1990s as a result of what was an otherwise legitimate Austrian parliamentary election, as you will remember, the EU and the other EU member states took punitive measures against Austria on the basis of the mere fact that an heir to the fascist tradition had entered a position of authority in Austria. And I think very much the same criteria should apply to other states, including Hungary. Now, I don't know enough about Orban and his party's background to say that they are a direct political heir of the fascist movement during the 30s and 40s, but their conduct, I think, particularly with regard to rule of law and other EU criteria, I think is a sufficiently brazen and direct violation that it's perfectly legitimate to speak about EU sanctions and punitive measures, particularly when in practice the EU is funding and financing Orban's continued hold on power by allowing him to basically bankroll his authoritarian regime. Now, the other one, you described the relationship between Israeli parties like Likud and European parties like Fidesz, I think it's called in Hungary, as strange bedfellows. Well, historically, they're not strange bedfellows at all. And if I can just briefly go into historical footnotes, Zionism, which I would define as Jewish nationalism, emerged in a European milieu which said that the Jews are a people like any other people in Europe, meaning in the context of the time that the Jews as a people are entitled to and should establish a nation state. In other words, it redefined Judaism from a religion to an ethnicity to a peoplehood to a nation. And the other principle on which Zionism was founded, it was, of course, one of the responses to the growing anti-Semitism in Europe at the time. And one of the founding principles of Zionism was that anti-Semitism is a permanent and immutable feature of European political life. And there are explicit quotes from the founding generation of Zionists, like Theodor Herzl and others, which basically say that the struggle against anti-Semitism is a futile struggle because it can never be won. And therefore, we Zionists should seek alliances of convenience with anti-Semitic forces because there is a joint objective. The Zionists want to promote the emigration of Jews from Europe to Palestine, and the anti-Semites want to promote the removal of Jews from Europe as well. So there is a very large and extensive and well-documented historical precedent and tradition of these alliances of convenience. On the face of it, I fully agree with you. They do indeed look like very strange bedfellows. But in substance, they operate on the basis of shared agendas.
Well, they do believe in the nation states in its romantic form. I suppose Jabotinsky definitely remains a model among Zionists for Netanyahu. So moving on to another theme or question. In public appearances and in articles appearing in Arab Reform magazine, you have said that you support the two-state settlement as a logical next step, and that ending the occupation now is the priority. But you do not support what you called earlier, not in Arab Reform, but elsewhere, the Mongol version of the two-state settlement as a fundamental ingredient in this peace process. Supporting this process at all once had a radical left aura to it, but since then it is received as conservative or as even Zionists by people who have read some spokespersons of BDS who I guess you might know well, like Ali Adinina or Ilan Pape from Israel. So can you explain for us, because this has also stranded many of our internal debates within DN25, can you explain what this Mongol version, as you call it, is, and where the rejectionism from the left, rejectionism from part of the Palestinian activist community like Hadimina, where does this come from? And I remember quite clearly how in around 2011 you had a face-off, a debate on Democracy Now, in which you defended, while he decried, an international effort to give Palestine an official member seat as observer in the UN. And so part of this movement was very much against it, and very much against all these paper victories.
Yes.
So where does this rejectionism come from? And
Well, let me clarify that as a matter of principle, um, and I've written this and stated it publicly elsewhere. As a matter of principle, it is indisputable that a one-state democratic outcome is very much the preferred resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's not something that I dispute or take issue with. Rather, the question is one of political strategy. Now, if you look at the realities in the Middle East, um, it's to me equally clear that if you're going to advocate for a one state outcome, that there is no political avenue to achieving that. The entire Israeli political elite and the overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews, from the extreme left to the extreme right, with very few exceptions, if there is one thing they are all agreed upon, it is maintaining or preserving the Jewish state. Now, do I agree with the preservation of a Jewish state? Of course not. But in practical terms, what this means is that if you want to achieve a one state outcome, you have to present a viable strategy for disestablishing Zionism from the Israeli state. And that means you have to present a viable military option to basically achieve victory, a military victory over Israel, because there is no political pathway to achieving a one-state outcome. Where civil rights marches and demonstrations and intifadas are not going to achieve a one-state outcome. The only, in my humble opinion, the only method in which you're going to achieve that is through a decisive military victory over the state of Israel. Now, there's another issue, which is that um, if you look at the international consensus that developed during the 1970s, the international community has basically laid out what their consensus is, which is the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, the inadmissibility of annexation and all the rest of it, support for the inalienable right of self-determination for the Palestinian people. And, to make a long story short, what the international community does support is an end to occupation, the establishment of a Palestinian state in the territories occupied in 1967, and last but by no means least, a just resolution of the refugee question. And my point of view is not that I disparage or reject or disagree with the one state solution, but unless you are able to present a credible military strategy for achieving it, you're talking pie in the sky because you can't achieve it through political means. Ending the occupation is something that I do believe can be achieved without a decisive military victory. Now, just one last point, if I may, on this point, which is that many people point to Oslo as the ultimate indictment of the so-called two-state paradigm. Well, my response to that is this has nothing to do with Oslo because Oslo was never about a two-state settlement. Oslo, in fact, was designed as an obstacle to Palestinian self-determination and as a means to perpetuate Israeli control over the Palestinian people and prevent an end to occupation. And so Oslo is neither Exhibit A nor Exhibit Z for the failure of any campaign to end the Israeli occupation, because it was never intended to do that. And it was not a failure, although, in fact, was an overwhelming success in maintaining Israeli domination over the Palestinian people, which is exactly what it was designed to do.
Well, the military victory scenario, which was the only possible precursor, as you see it, to such an, as it is imagined, a one-state solution. I mean, this has manifested as a talking point in the Arab world in speeches of Assad's and Saddam Hussein and of regional dictatorships. They promised to their populations to do this, but it has been impossible. And I take it that you support the non-violent um, route to achieving peace in that area.
May I just interrupt you and say, I have no principled objection to the use of armed force. This is not about being a pacifist.
Mhm.
I can think of numerous examples throughout history where the resort to armed force
Mhm.
by states or opposition movements has, in my view, been legal, legitimate, and entirely justified, and in some cases, even rational. Rather, I was making the point that in this particular case,
Mhm.
um, there is no military option, at least for the foreseeable future, in order to achieve the preferred outcome. There are political pathways to achieving what is a minimally acceptable outcome.
But why do those who reject your your view, which seems rather uh, clear or rational, what is their motivation for insisting on a one state answer tomorrow? I mean,
Well,
if,
again, I mean, this is a little of reading tea leaves, but
yeah,
from my interaction with these people, my understanding is that they are looking, quite correctly in my view, at the
mhm,
morality of the issue. And when you look at the injustice that has been done to the Palestinian people and the nature of the Israeli state and so on, well, I think, anyone with a conscience is going to say that a one state outcome is preferable and more just and more this and more that. So no disagreement there. That, but I think for, many of these people, they base their political strategy on, or rather, they base their political conclusions on their understanding of morality and preferred outcomes, which is all well and good, but they don't answer the crucial question of how are you going to achieve it. And and this is applicable, I think, in a lot of political situations around the world. Secondly, I think some of these people also have, if I can put it politely, perhaps some illusions about how you can achieve that outcome. I've heard people suggest that tactics like BDS and civil rights marches and other nonviolent means can basically bring the Israeli state to its knees. I disagree.
so I've heard you say in the past about the New Republic magazine. The less New Republic, the better. This is a magazine well known in the United States, which
Sorry, this is something I've said?
I think so. Well,
Well, I don't remember saying it, but certainly the New Republic that I used to read in the 80s and the 90s, I would amend that to say no New Republic would have been best.
yes, that's quite funny. Well, the New Republic's magazine's managing editor from the 1990s, if my sources are accurate, Peter Brainard,
Mhm.
also vocally supported the Iraq War and then regretted it. Recently, this month, came out in the press advocating for a one-state solution in major newspapers and claiming that the two-state solution is "quote unquote" dead. So, uh, why would Brainard try to take distance from Israel? Do you believe this comes from genuine concerns for human rights, or how would you assess such a transformation?
Well, I'm not going to pretend to be able to read his mind. I did read his opinion piece in the New York Times. I think it came out a few days ago,
Yeah.
and I think it's a very good example of my response to your previous question.
Mhm.
He lays out a case of why a one state solution is preferable to a two state settlement. And that's something I think very few reasonable people would disagree with. I certainly wouldn't, even though I think he takes it too much from a perspective of what would be good for the future of Israel rather than for the Palestinians. But that notwithstanding, he lays out a convincing case of why a one-state solution is preferable. But the question isn't, do you prefer this or that? It's how are you going to achieve not only what you prefer, but anything. It's like, standing in an orange grove and saying that apples taste much better. Well, of course they do, but you're in an orange grove. So that's number one. Number two, and I don't mean this as a personal attack at all, but I've always had an issue with people who, when it really mattered, were all gung ho for invading Iraq and destroying the state and its society and all the rest of it. And then only when things began to go wrong from their perspective, discovered that it actually wasn't such a great idea. They did make, you go back to the Vietnam War, all these people who had no problem with tens and then hundreds of thousands and then millions of Vietnamese and Cambodians and Laotians being, bombed into smithereens. But then when the cost in terms of the lives of American soldiers began to get excessively high, they turned against the war. Well, it's good that they turned against the war. And if they hadn't turned against the war, it might not have ended as soon as it did. But let's not give them any moral credit for a failure to do the right thing when it mattered.
I want to talk to you about the Iran nuclear deal and the EU's role in that, or their sudden absence of that. You commented in the past on Obama's Iran nuclear deal. Recently, the New York Times and Jarariya.com, Middle East Reporter, reported that Israel planted a bomb, what was previously thought to be a cyber attack, in an Iranian nuclear site last week. This perhaps recalling a historical precedent, the Israeli attack on Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor in the time of Menachem Begin, called Operation Opera, long ago. Recently, we have seen the EU respond in a very obedient, conciliatory manner to Trump's White House, despite their initial condemnation and rejecting of Trump's attempting to sabotage and attack the Iran nuclear deal. We saw some defiance from Germany at first, from Angela Merkel, but acting almost as if they had no choice, no way out of Washington. They comply. Is the EU simply being spineless, or does the EU really find itself in a catch-22 situation when it comes to upholding what they signed on to during the Obama era? Do they face that much to lose by defying the US and the White House here?
Yeah. Sorry, were you done?
And well, most importantly of all, how can the EU defy the US? How should they behave when it comes to this lack of consistency with what they signed on to when it comes to Iran and the crippling sanctions now?
Well, it's one of the key international questions of our time, is that whatever one may think of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement that was reached in 2015, it was a success for diplomacy. And according to most analysts who are specialized in the subject, it most likely averted what would have been yet another war in the Middle East, and one that was most likely to be considerably more devastating than the war in Iraq. Now, part of the problem is in the design of the agreement. The agreement was designed so as to account for eventual acts of Iranian bad faith. It completely ignored what actually happened, which was the total absence of any good faith by the other key party to the agreement, which was the United States, after Team Trump took over in January of 2017 and began basically doing everything possible to undermine the agreement, then withdrew from the agreement as soon as John Bolton became National Security Advisor, and is now basically it's now doing two things. It's trying to make it impossible for the other parties to the agreement, primarily the Europeans, to continue with their commitment to that agreement. And I think it's also seeking to accelerate the push towards what could very well turn out to be a armed confrontation with Iran during the remainder of this year by, for example, the assassination of General Soleimani in January, the so-called maximum pressure campaign, and so on. But anyway, getting back to your question, I think I don't mean to underestimate the size of the challenge, because the United States, does to a very significant degree control the international financial system and so on. And so defying the U.S. is no trivial matter. But what had been suggested for some time was that the EU or European states pass laws similar to laws which exist in other countries, which would make it a criminal offense for companies and corporations operating within the EU to play along with sanctions which are not part of European legislation. In other words, please, did you?
So is there a threat on the future horizon of consequences for these multinational corporations which cooperated with illegal sanctions coming?
No, but that's the problem. I mean, put yourself, and I hope this would never happen, but put yourself in the shoes of being the CEO of a major European company or corporation. How much, even if you're allowed to freely conduct business with Iran, how much of your revenue is that going to generate compared to the revenue that you generate by either being able, to conduct business in or with the United States, or by not being sanctioned by the United States. So, Iran is not worth it for most of these companies. But if they were threatened with prosecution for basically participating in illegal sanctions, then many of these companies wouldn't have to make that choice themselves about whether or not to conduct business with Iran. And my understanding is there had been such proposals on the European agenda at some point, but they fell away. But now the other key issue coming up, I think, in the next month or two, is that the United States, which made a very public display of proclaiming its withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear agreement, is now seeking to reimpose an arms embargo on Iran via the United Nations Security Council on the grounds that it is still part of that agreement. And that's become a major issue of European American contention. And so I would say that this issue will also help us do a proper examination of how much bone is left in the European spinal column.
So there's a mix of lassitude. On the one hand, the EU could hold businesses to account for obeying illegal sanctions. On the other hand, the EU has for decades gone down the path of Thatcherism, of non-interference in corporate decisions, laissez-faire. And on the other hand, there's a bureaucratic consideration.
Can I interrupt? Because what you've said is not entirely correct. I don't remember the precise details, but I do know that at one point, the United States began sanctioning European companies that operated in Cuba on the grounds that they were dealing in property or whatever that, according to American law, had been illegally nationalized by the Cuban government after 1959. And the European Union and European governments took a very firm position on this issue with the United States and successfully compelled Washington to stand down. Now, another reason I raise this issue is because the United States itself has legislation, for example, in the 70s and 80s, that made it illegal for U.S. corporations to participate in the or to show respect for the Arab League boycott of Israel. It would have been a crime for an American company to refuse to do business with Israel on the grounds that it needed to boycott Israel in order to preserve its commercial interests in the Arab world. And okay, the U.S., is a significantly greater economic power than the European Union, but this is an option that's very clearly available to European legislators and decision makers.
But the likelihood that Trump will continuously punish the one of the major trading blocs in the world, which, I mean, Trump would not ever conceivably, for example, bomb Western Europe. I mean, well, okay.
At this point, nothing is out of the question, but you're probably right. Yeah.
I mean, with being the most affluent region in the world, except Western Europe, is in every position to stomach, to take some kind of economic consequence in order to maintain rule of law. But it
Yes.
will not be the smallest sacrifice.
Yes, you're right. But the problem here is that the problem has been shifted onto the decisions of individual European companies and corporations. So of course they're not going to defy the United States, because it would basically be a situation of these individual European companies taking on the might of the US legal and financial system. But I completely agree with you that if there was European legislation or a political decision that created a reality of collective defiance of these American tertiary sanctions, I have no doubt that these sanctions would become very quickly ineffective and most likely irrelevant as well.
Impossible to respect, because Western Europe has the most respectability in the world of trade, apparently. Or yes, well, we'll move on to another question. A topic we often discuss in VM25's discussion group for imagining an alternative foreign policy for the EU, which I represent the interest of that group in this interview of you. A topic we discussed there concerns how the EU should stop the unbridled flow of weapons. Since
flow of weapons, you said?
Yes, weapons manufacture, arms trade, and transaction. And this inevitably bears upon the Middle East, where various, I think there was a study on Jadalia.com, what Europe owes Syrian refugees, that explored how much revenue each country got from selling weapons to diverse factions in the Syria conflict. But Syria being the complicated maze that it is, we won't enter that in this conversation, though I know you have much to say about Syria. Now, Germany and France have official guidelines, according to Deutsche Welle, perhaps guidelines also in legislation, but I'm not sure, I don't know, indicating they should not sell or supply weapons to any third country, as they call it, which is currently embroiled in conflicts with neighbors. So one would think that would prevent dealings with states like Saudi Arabia, Israel in the midst of these conflicts, or even Egypt today, as Sisi persecutes his own people. Some of these states have officially a position of insisting they do not know whether Israel has a nuclear weapons program. What do you think is the real reasoning behind all this confusing messaging? On the one hand, they're not supposed to supply weapons to countries engaged in from wars, from conflicts. On the other hand, clearly they find a zone of exception. Is it even, and I would add this question, if it's not too much, to that. I would relate it to the next question. Is it even realistic for citizens' initiatives like ours to want to successfully pressure representatives in the EU to stop this weapons supply sales, whether it's to Saudi Arabia, whether it's to Israel? What legal mechanisms do you think we could use to stop countries in the EU from doing this? Is the ICC, the International Criminal Court, possibility? I hope that I did not ask too many questions conflated into one for you.
Well, perhaps to answer your second question first, that I think, yes, citizens' initiatives can be very useful and can also be effective if it comes to specific individual arms transactions that may be able to be stopped through sufficient public pressure that then translates into pressure on the government through parliament and so on. It's something I would certainly support and encourage. But I think in the broader picture, the arms export policies of many of these countries, of most countries, should, I think, primarily be seen not only as a commercial venture, but as a reflection of the foreign policy of the states and governments concerned. And so where I think the real change needs to come ultimately is not in the field of export licenses and these technical details, because it's ultimately a political issue, but in how these countries approach foreign policy towards the Middle East. Do they think Israel basically, even though they may not agree with it, essentially has a right of impunity in its dealings with the Palestinians? Well, then of course they're going to continue selling weapons to Israel. Do they consider having good relations with Saudi Arabia because of its role in the global energy supply and its role as a market for their goods and services? Well, what's going to stop them? They're not going to jeopardize that by suspending weapons. So it's really, I think, a matter about how these states and governments orient their foreign policy that ultimately will determine their policies on arms sales and exports.
And thus far, their foreign policy seems very much married to United States foreign policy.
Well, yes, but I'm beginning to get slightly hopeful that the experience of the past 4 years may have finally begun to persuade at least some Europeans that they should perhaps consider beginning to display not independence, but perhaps the beginnings of autonomy and with the rest of the world.
This is the message that we try to stress within our foreign policy discussion group, which remains a rather eccentric group within DM. Speaking of measures resembling sanctions in response to human rights abuses, before the coronavirus epidemic, this world quarantine has halted things in the world, there were parliamentary discussions about the need to label products made in these settlements as such, so that the European consumer can make a decision knowing whether a product comes from somewhere in Israel within the internationally recognized legal borders, or where it comes from the settlements. But do you have any hopes for that being enforced? Has it been, to an extent, adequately brought up by now? Because I remember you expressing this hope years ago in a conference.
Well, I expressed a little different hope than the one you're referring to. To me, it's always been a matter of exasperation that this debate is even taking place. I mean, the debate within Europe has been going on for decades about whether or not products that come from settlements that are illegal under international law and are considered illegal by the Europeans themselves should enjoy the same preferential access to the European market as Israeli goods. I mean, when was the last time you went to a jeweler and saw something properly labeled a blood diamond? Of course, you're not going to find it because their very presence in the European market is considered illegal. So, I find this debate to be quite a diversion, where I think the real debate should be applying the rule of law and ensuring that these products enjoy zero access to the European market. Because again, this is, one of the manners of European complicity and what we've been seeing. Because by allowing these products access to the European market, whether preferential or otherwise, the settlements remain an economically viable enterprise.
And like many corporations in the world, under the state, they receive a subsidy also their enterprises from you.
Yes, you mean from the Israeli government?
Yes.
Well, and that's one reason that there may be this view that that the overwhelming majority of settlers there are either religious or nationalist fanatics, and that's the only reason they're living there. For a good portion of them, that's certainly an accurate description. But if you look at cost of living indices and so on, for many Israelis, it's actually cheaper to live in the settlements because of the subsidies, and you enjoy a higher quality of living at a cheaper price. Now, unless you have a well-developed conscience, which is in increasingly short supply in Israel, who would say no to that?
Well, a great number of what they call the ultra-Orthodox or the Haredi, they're blamed by the secular part of Israel for their total non-participation in either the army or the settler movement.
Yes, but that's beginning to change in terms of both their participation in the Israeli army and their participation in the settlement enterprise as well. But it's worthwhile, I think, to point out, as you imply, that this entire thing, that we call the occupation and settler colonialism and settlement expansion and so on, has been an overwhelmingly secular project by the Israeli state, with religious overtones, to be sure, but it has not been led by the ultra Orthodox groups.
So the left, what they call the left, or the secular establishment, made an enormous, very ambiguous compromise to
Yes.
So you have often criticized the Egyptian Sisi regime, or junta, military junta, as an enemy of the Palestinians and Gaza especially. Sisi also, most significantly oppresses his own people with terror campaigns, forced disappearances of young Egyptian dissidents. Even a few EU young exchange students from Europe have disappeared or died under the regime of Sisi. How is Sisi dependent, in your esteem? I hope we're not straying far from your, I hope we're not straying from your area, but how is Sisi dependent on the EU investment in his regime in Egypt shortly? And how does that also worsen the plight of the isolated Palestinians in Gaza, as they primarily suffer from his?
I'm not sure I understood your question. Is it how is Sisi dependent on the European Union? Was that your question?
Yes, on support from the European Union.
Well, if you go back a few years, the initial European response to Sisi's coup and horrific abuses of the Egyptian people and so on, initially the Europeans were quite cool to Sisi. They didn't They didn't treat him as illegitimate by any means, but they tried to keep a distance from him and didn't want to be seen in public with him too much and so on. And then you began to get the refugee crisis, and that overnight transformed Sisi into a valuable international ally, for helping to decrease the number of brown people who might try to make it across the Mediterranean into the southern flank of Europe. And so I think this is an important part of the equation that, on the one hand, that Sisi, like Mubarak before him and Sadat before him, have been able to successfully market themselves to the Europeans as leaders who were able to ensure stability within their countries and are able to prevent the export of their domestic problems to Europe through refugee crises or radicalism or whatnot. And so, in that sense, I think Sisi is increasingly being seen as a dependable ally, and human rights concerns and issues like that, to the extent that they were ever meaningful on the European agenda with respect to Egypt, have, for all intents and purposes, disappeared.
Mhm. So the recent elections in Israel, which uh, created a moment of suspense when the world thought that Netanyahu's lucky streak had ended. That election saw an unprecedented participation of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, what's called in Israel the quote unquote Arab vote. In September last year, an op ed appeared in the New York Times by Ayman Odeh, Arab leader of the Joint List and of an Israeli Communist Party. I think it's called Democratic Front for Peace and Equality. And the op ed very confidently had the title, "We are ending Netanyahu's grip on Israel." Uh, maybe I should, well, I think I don't need to now explain to the viewers what the Joint List is, other than an alliance of progressive political parties within Israel. So I would like to know what you thought of this, other than their, of course, obvious enormous disappointment of these young Israeli Palestinian citizens who strategically voted against Netanyahu for guns, to suddenly see that he is very lax on the annexation talk and on all this extremism. But what do you think of this rise or this new phenomenon?
I think perhaps no one is as responsible for it as Netanyahu, because there is a long tradition among substantial portions of the Palestinian community within Israel of boycotting these elections because they view Israel as an illegitimate state. And there is also a long tradition of division and fragmentation among the main political forces within the Palestinian community in Israel, between communists and nationalists and Islamists and so on. Now, the level of incitement under the Netanyahu government in the past few years reached such a crescendo. And then, of course, with the passage of the nation state law, which defined Israel as a state in which the only people who have a right to self-determination are the Jewish people, and so on. I mean, it's the equivalent of the United Kingdom defining itself as an English state.
Anglo-Saxon states.
Yeah, or no, an English state, meaning, if you're Scottish or Welsh or Irish, you're formally a second-class British citizen. And so this put this community's back to the wall, and they were able to um, uh, put their differences, at least temporarily, aside, and form this parliamentary coalition called the Joint List, which then, first of all, gave it greater parliamentary representation, and then, because of the ceaseless incitement from Netanyahu, and I should say most others across the Israeli political spectrum, particularly on the right, many people who otherwise would have refused to vote or wouldn't really have cared about voting came out and voted for this group. So it was able to become a substantial force in the Israeli parliament. Now, where they went wrong, if I can use that term, is that they assumed that the blue and white coalition, which was the main rival to Netanyahu and the Likud, would make at least informal agreements with them, because they shared the joint objective, if for different reasons, of removing Netanyahu from power. What happened in practice was that Netanyahu and Benny Gantz decided they have more in common with each other than to allow a situation where an Israeli government would have to rely on the active or passive support of legitimately elected Arab members of parliament. And that's kind of the short version of what happened.
So I'm very interested in knowing if you project in any way a future for a movement like this Democratic Front for Peace and Equality, which is a non-confessional socialist party in Israel, if they have an interesting role to play in the future towards ending the occupation by peaceful means, and also, yes.
Well, the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality is
right.
It's either the Communist Party or a coalition led by the Communist Party. I forget for the moment which is in turn one of the component members of the joint list that we were just discussing.
Yes. Do you see them playing any interesting role in the future?
Well, I think the interesting thing to look at moving forward is that the Israeli Labor Party has finally managed to obliterate itself under the weight of its own contradictions, and parties that were traditionally associated with the Israeli left have made political compromises that have made themselves increasingly unpalatable for Israelis who would in previous years have voted for them. And you're now beginning to get a phenomenon, a very modest one to be sure, but one that under the right circumstances may expand, of progressive Israeli Jews voting for the joint list because they see it as the movement which is conducting the most principled opposition to Netanyahu and his policies. And the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality, which you just mentioned, is of course a component of this joint list.
Yes. Before last question, I will turn on the lights in this room.
Please.
Sorry, I just didn't want to disturb by moving on. So how has the threat of annexation and other provocations from Likud, from the Israeli government, from altogether, not specifically Likud, how have these disappointments and how has the shock of the annexation, if it was a shock, potentially united different factions, political factions in Palestine, or not? And what can you tell us? This is this question describing the Palestinian political landscape now in the occupied Palestinian territories would be, I'm sure, quite extensive subject matter to explore.
Well, sorry, were you done asking the question? Did I cut you off? Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I've seen only the most limited indications that the rival Palestinian leaderships and the political forces they represent have shown themselves capable of rising to the occasions. and recognizing that the current situation represents a collective existential threat to all Palestinians, and on that basis, trying to work out at least minimally acceptable alliances of convenience, to say nothing of restoring national unity. So, again, I've seen very little indications, and I'm very pessimistic that over the short term, these groups and leaderships who are now increasingly heavily invested in their division and the benefits it offers to each of them, to see them rise above the occasion, unfortunately.
So there is a leadership void currently in Palestine.
Well, in terms of formal leadership, it's there. I would say more of a leadership crisis,
Yes.
and the absence of leadership that is considered even minimally legitimate by a growing proportion of Palestinians.
You are referring to the Palestinian Authority or also other established security?
Well, primarily to the Palestinian Authority, but I think that description is increasingly applicable to others as well.
Mm-hmm. I had I had two more questions.
Please.
Well, but if you would prefer to take questions from the audience, but we do have some time. So let's talk about UN reform. Hello? I don't see your side of the screen now. Okay. Well, it seems that Mouin's connection has dropped.
I'm sorry, my line dropped. I missed your last two sentences.
We saw that. Yeah, you told us earlier that the electricity in Washington reminded you of the Middle East in the early 90s.
I think I referred to the 70s.
The 70s. Beirut. Well, yes. So, so to change the subject for a minute from the precise region we've been discussing, a popular cause among the Western left today, and this is a question I'm curious about, that might seem like out of the blue, or bearing little relation to previous, but the popular cause among the Western left today seems to be the cause of Kurdistan. And
the cause of Kurdistan, you said?
And the Kurdish people.
Yes.
Yeah. And I sometimes find it difficult to understand how the left finds it uncontroversial, as from the left we denounce the Israeli activity in the Golan Heights, but then there is how does this not contradict with the kind of uncontroversial supports to a Kurdish eventual statehood, which would comprise, in essence, large parts of Syria, Iraq, and Iran? What view could you? Is this a contradiction? And what view do you have of the U.S. support for Kurdistan, or for certain factions, wavering support or unsteady support?
Well, I think that's a long and complicated question. I think
Sorry.
To get first things first out of the way is that the Kurds, like any other people, I think, are entitled to the right of self-determination. But whether that in their individual national contexts means they also have an inalienable right to secede from the states in which they live is, I think, different and much more difficult question to answer, because then it also infringes on the inalienable rights of those who live among them, and questions of borders and the regional system and so on. So I think one needs to proceed from this question of affirming their rights, but also recognizing the complexity, particularly when you have a people that is spread over 4 states in the region. A second point I would make is that the Kurdish establishment leadership since the Second World War has shown itself to be catastrophically opportunistic. And I think the main victims of its opportunism have been the Kurds themselves. Now, at a certain level, one can understand that in certain periods they were experiencing levels of desperation that perhaps for some would um, would help explain why they sought alliances with people like the Shah of Iran and Israel and Kissinger and so on. But they don't seem to have um, recognized, the catastrophe that these alliances have brought on them. And to the contrary, you have the same leaders still in power, making the same alliances to a certain extent to the same effect. So and also I think it's a very different context, between Iran and Turkey and Iraq and Syria. What we don't know is to what extent do these different Kurdish populations, want to live in an independent Kurdish state that encompasses all these Kurdish regions. Um, if indeed they do, to what extent is that politically feasible, and to what extent can that be done in a way that also respects the rights of Arabs and Turks and Iranians who live among them? Where do you draw the border? Think of the question of Kirkuk in Iraq, for example. I think the one thing that can be said with certainty is that the involvement of foreign powers in the Kurdish question has been catastrophic for the Kurds and has not served them well, and that we need to find mechanisms and formulas by way of which um, issues between these various Kurdish populations and the states in which they live can be resolved without foreign agendas intervening.
Yes, certainly the region is sufficiently fragmented as it is at present. I have one last question
Please.
before we continue to tire our dear guests, and then we will open to questions from the audience if these arise. UN reform is a topic we've begun to talk about within DM25 because it does seem
UN reform?
United Nations reform. So
is being discussed by who? I'm not sure I heard you correctly.
Within DM25, among friends and comrades within DM25, we discussed the topic of different visions for UN reform in order to make the UN less bureaucratic and more effective. And I remember you have also pointed out how some UN Secretary Generals like Ban Ki-moon had a mediocre performance compared to predecessors, which allowed certain bloodbaths, like in Syria, to get worse. When it comes to the crisis of the Palestinians, do you envision a need or a possibility for reforming the United Nations to make it more effective? And do you have any ideas so that all these paper victories that the Palestinians have in recent decades accumulated, which the main paper victories like UN Security Council Resolution 242, which Norman Finkelstein often talks about, and which was revamped in another resolution. Would it require UN reform to make these into a vital political force? And how do you have you envisioned that? Like,
Well, perhaps I should preface by saying, if one wants to be fair to the UN, and that that's not necessarily going to be the case with everybody, but in fairness to the UN, it does not exist independently of its member states. So we're not dealing with a body that can adopt decisions and then implement policies, whether its member states support it in doing so or not. So it's, you can think of it in a sense like a hostage situation, if you want to put it very crudely. But having said that, it's also true that the UN's organizational structure is, in certain respects, getting increasingly anachronistic. Britain is a permanent member of the Security Council. On what basis? What does it represent?
Brexit is Brexit.
Yeah, well, even more. I'm even referring to the UK before Brexit. It just doesn't make any sense. Um, uh, um, so there's that. There's the whole, and it's also true that you find within the UN bureaucracy a situation where, whether it's for careerist or opportunistic motives, that in contrast to previous decades, you will find officials and staff and so on who will go out of their way not to offend the United States and not to offend Israel, because that would be considered offensive by the United States. So there is a certain paralysis that has set in, and there's an object lesson here. The former Secretary General Boutros Ghali was basically thrown out of the UN because he dared to release a report that revealed certain facts about Israeli conduct in Lebanon during the 1990s, and it was kind of the old saying, "Kill one, teach 100." Well, it has.
At the time of Ariel Sharon, the first Lebanon war.
No, I believe at the time it was Shimon Peres or Rabin who was a prime minister. But the decision, this had to do with Israeli conduct during the 1990s, not the 1982 invasion.
Oh, of course, yes.
Yeah. And so you asked me for if I have specific ideas about this. I thinking just off the top of my head, there does seem to be a tendency to throw a committee at every problem,
Yeah.
and that hasn't been working. When you have situations, for example, you had for a long period two special envoys for Lebanon. One for this resolution and one for that resolution. The Secretary General's envoy in the occupied territories is there for the promotion of the peace process. Even though that peace process doesn't exist, and no one is even pretending that it exists. When Lakhdar Ibrahimi resigned, after both he and before him Kofi Annan had resigned as special envoys on Syria because they felt that their agendas and proposals have been sabotaged. To me, it seemed to make sense not to appoint a successor until a role would have existed for one. But there was kind of this, bureaucratic momentum that meant it had to go straight through.
We will open now. Hopefully, we had a long and drawn-out interview, which will go viral forever, I hope, but or for a while it's still relevant. So we open for questions in the YouTube chat. And there's an echo, which I will try to.
I can't hear you.
So, a question from Mohammed Tahir Nahas, a Lebanese uh, a Lebanese member of DM. Netanyahu's son stated that he wants to see a Christian Europe again, with the current tensions between the EU states and right-wing families taking power. I don't understand this as a question. Do you worry that, this is the next question from Mohammed Khair Nahas, DM member from Lebanon, do you worry that this integration of EU markets would lower its bargaining leverage, and would an EU-like project help be able to help stabilize the Middle East?
Yeah, well, that's three questions. On Netanyahu's son, I would repeat, what I said earlier in response to your comment about Netanyahu and Orban forming strange bedfellows. Well, when you get an Israeli leader, calling for a Christian Europe, and given what has been the history of the Jewish people in Christian Europe, well, again, one has to understand that for the Zionist movement and the Israeli state, um, the strategic objective is the state and the power of the state, and wherever there is a contradiction between the interests of the state and the interests of the Jews in Europe or anywhere else, invariably the state wins out. And one only needs to look at the history of how Israel and before the Zionist movement dealt with European anti-Semitism to see that. In terms of the disintegration of the EU market, I'm not sure that market has disintegrated, but to the extent that it has, obviously, the more unified that market is, the more powerful it is going to be in the global arena.
You mentioned Israel's history of dealing with anti-Semitism in Europe, but also during the 70s, Menachem Begin was very eager to sell weapons to the Argentinian and Chilean military dictatorships, who were openly anti-Semitic and tortured many Jewish intellectuals and dissidents. So here's another question. Would regional co-ops of countries, thus creating a large pressuring group, such as the African Union or the unions of South American countries, I suppose he's referring to Mercosur, would that possibly lead to redistribution of power in the UN?
Well, so far it hasn't. And also, I think, when you look at regional groupings, whether it's the African Union or the Arab League or Mercosur or whatever, they do not represent a unified political agenda. I think that's been one of the strengths of the European Union, which is, while there has been only limited political integration, economic integration took place at least on the basis of political alignment. Now, that political alignment is obviously not, what it was in years past with the Visegrad group and so on. But when you look at these other regional groupings, for example, the Arab League, it contains, or it used to contain, blocs that were virtually at war with each other, and I think you can say the same about some of these other regional groups. But to the extent that they can unite on these agenda points, I don't know enough about UN bureaucratic procedures that would allow them to increase their powers or change the current distribution of power within it. But yeah, that could be one effort worth pursuing.
You sound like what Gramsci called a pessimist of the intellect, optimist of the will.
Well, I think it's more ignorance of bureaucracy that that produced my response.
Now we have a question from Alex Tiffin, who I believe is either from UK, is from England or Scotland. What do you all think will occur if and when Israel carries out annexation? For example, on the ground in Palestine and Israel, will Jordan do anything? and the international community in general?
Yeah, I'm at this stage, I'm not very optimistic because getting back to your first question, I think the Europeans gave very clear signals to the Israelis that this is not something they want to see happen. And the annexation did not take place on July 1st. One would have expected that the Europeans would have taken advantage of that window of opportunity to spell out very clearly to the Israelis of these are the measures that we are going to take if you nevertheless come back and implement annexation without any ifs, ands, or buts. These are the punitive measures that you will be compelled to endure, and they haven't done that.
There's a confounding silence. There's a
Yeah, well, not entirely, but nevertheless, the vagueness of the initial response has persisted. Maybe the Europeans are hoping that annexation is now off the agenda, particularly because Trump is weakening and may no longer be around in January. But for whatever reason, I think it's a genuine lost opportunity that the Europeans, who, after all, are Israel's largest trading partner, are not taking advantage to do what they can to prevent annexation, because they will have to deal with the consequences of it,
yes.
including in Crimea. I should add. Well, in the sense that you can't get on your high horse and rail against the illegitimacy of annexation in one place, and then at the end of the day act as if nothing happened in another place. It just doesn't work in the 21st century anymore for Europeans.
So Moscow and these Donetsk rebels and so forth will use that example to show that the EU is.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that the the EU policy of seeking to reverse the Russian annexation of Crimea and mobilizing the international community to impose consequences on Russia for maintaining the annexation of Crimea becomes a much more difficult proposition to sustain when you're effectively looking the other direction while Israel annexes West Bank territory. And I'm not a specialist on these issues, but I suspect many historians would say that most likely Russia has a stronger claim to Crimea than Israel has to the Jordan Valley.
Yes. We hope that they will back up their promises and bluster and keep to the rule of law, or not just look the other way in case. Well, we are nearing the very end, I guess, of the session. I mean, there is a question, and I think you answered it at the beginning, so I don't want to have you repeat yourself, but Nicholas Huckner, a DM25 member, is asking, is a two-state solution really what the Palestinians ultimately want? Is it not a defeat for them? Nicholas Huckner.
Well, you could make the argument, theoretically, that anything other than a restoration of Palestine to full and exclusive Arab sovereignty is a defeat for the Palestinians. And again, I would repeat what I stated earlier in response to your question, Arturo, which is that to me it is indisputable that the best and most just outcome, certainly over the longer term, would be a single democratic state in which Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews live in individual and communal equality. The problem is that there appear at present no means of attaining that ideal, because the only means of attaining that ideal, at least in in my humble opinion, would be through a decisive military victory. And therefore, while we may hold on to this ideal, we also have to see what possibilities do exist that are short of absolute justice, that have a realistic opportunity of being attained over um, the foreseeable term, that can provide at least partial justice and partial relief to as many Palestinians as possible. I think, and I, by the way, I have, in the current context, I have some difficulty with this whole debate over one versus two state solution. As I've written elsewhere, it reminds me a bit of a condemned prisoner the night before their execution, agonizing over whether to spend the next summer holiday on the French or Italian Riviera. I mean, you know, the operative reality here is that neither a one nor two nor three state solution is being offered to the Palestinians. I like to think of it more as there is a realistic prospect if the Palestinians are able to rejuvenate their national movement and play their cards right and mobilize their allies and ensure that those who are not their allies either get on board or get out of the way. There's a realistic prospect of an effective and even successful campaign against the occupation that does not require military resources that neither the Palestinians nor the Arabs nor their allies currently possess. But sorry, but is a two-state settlement, does that offer the Palestinians less than a one-state solution? Of course it does. Does it represent a defeat? Well, relative to absolute justice and relative to what the Palestinians are entitled to, yes. But you know, relative to the reality in which they presently find themselves, it would not only be a significant step forward, but the other reason that I think a successful campaign to end the occupation could be meaningful is because it could have a transformative impact on Israeli-Palestinian relations, and particularly on the internal domestic political equation and balance of power within Israel.
And this could have a long-term, step-by-step
Yes.
process to where we would all want to go, just a borderless, larger borderless region.
Well, there's some people who suggest, and among them, towards the end of his life, Edward Said, the famous Palestinian intellectual, you know, Edward Said made his name in the 1970s with a book called The Question of Palestine, which was basically a book-length exposition of the two-state settlement at a time when it had virtually no Palestinian adherents. He opposed Oslo in the 1990s, not because it would lead to a two-state settlement, but because it obstructed a two-state settlement and would make it, in his view, impossible. And on that basis, he then became a convert and a very eloquent advocate for the one-state solution. Now, I had the privilege to interview him in Jerusalem. I believe it was in 2001. And when I asked him about this, I said, you know, so are you saying that, you know, the struggle for one state means that Palestinians should abandon the campaign against the occupation? And he said, no, to the contrary. And I'm paraphrasing him here, but he said something along the lines of the campaign against occupation remains essential, and if it succeeds, could in fact lay the basis for a peaceful one-state outcome. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I gladly defer to him on this point.
Yes, well, ideally, after the end of all this quite terrible conflict, this might be a Benelux type outcome for the not so far future, I hope.
One never knows.
Thank you very much, Mouin Rabbani, for and for these lucid and this very sober political analysis and interview. And sorry for the technical problem somewhere in the middle of the lighting. But yes, I think that, of course, I would have more questions for you and more to talk about, but I think we have reached, we are a little bit over the time limit. And I suppose Miriam, the technical mediator, wants us to wrap up now.
Yeah, I see that.
Yes. Well, hopefully.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed our discussion.
Thank you.
Okay.
So did I and our audience, and hopefully it gets us out of our current swamp when it comes to this discussion within DiEM25. Well, and perhaps we will resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening. Bye.